Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth, and it's opposite of mythology, which means a science or study of fake lie or imagination. And needless to mention that if you mention the word biblical mythology, you will have probably eggs thrown at you. But it is very convenient for academics to call Vedas and Puranas as mythology because it doesn't belong to their own education system. But we have coined a new term. So we coined the term Sattology for Puranas, Ramayana, Mahabharata. And through my 11 books, I have proved it. Like I have now probably Netflix is going to make a movie on one of my books, One Arrow, One Kill, where we are going to go through to the places of Ramayana all over the world, including South America. And I proved it with maps and Sanskrit shlokas from Valmiki Ramayana. I have a very, very special guest. I mean, there is a whole Wikipedia page about him. Professor M D Nalapat. You can read about him, Madhav Das Nalapat. And I'm going to send a Wikipedia page on him. He is the India's first professor of geopolitics and also the UNESCO Peace Chair at Manipal University. And he has done so many things. You can check out on Google and you'll find him. And he's also the editor of the Sunday Guardian Live and the Daily Guardian. So without delay, let us welcome Professor M D Nalapat.
Thank you, Aditya.
So
great to be with you and all your friends.
So you have been in this field for so long. I think you are yourself an institution now in this area. And for all the students, I'm going to ask you, how do you see the world has changed between 90s and 2000s and 2000s to 2022?
Well, I'd like to say that in the 1990s, the fiction that China would evolve its system and become a social democracy was very, very strong. It was received doctrine in the Clinton White House, for example, and in much of the think tanks, official Washington, etc., etc. That was only a question of time before prosperity ensured that China would evolve into social democracy and it would not be a communist state. Certainly, that China would continue on a path of working together with the Western world. It had done that throughout the Cold War 1.0 between the US and the USSR. It had been for much of that period the strongest supporter of the United States in its efforts at weakening the USSR. I think from the year about 2000 and let's say 2000 onwards, there was a change in that. Of course, 9/11 upset the apple cart to the benefit of China, if I may say so, because the concentration of attention of George W. Bush, who was then the president, newly elected president, under the Clintons, China got a free pass, actually. But George W. Bush was trying to be more realistic about China. And then 9/11 occurred, and his entire attention got shifted from China to Afghanistan. And subsequently, fortunately or otherwise, a lot of what happened later was otherwise. Although I must say that Saddam Hussein, being what he was, removing him could not have been a bad thing. But that is the biggest change, actually. Today, you hardly see anyone who believes that China is a benign force. And when some of us were talking in terms of the Chinese, going in for a new Cold War 2.0, their system against the US system, one was almost laughed at. You had a systemic conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union promoted its system. The United States promoted, if not its own system, certainly a system which is antithetical to that of the United States. But in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, from 100 years ago, they have been very, very clear that there is only room for one system in the world, and that is the system of the Chinese Communist Party. So from that point of view, I'd like to say they have been very consistent. Where I think a lot of us have got it wrong is in misreading the tea leaves, so to speak. But by around 2004, 2005, despite 9/11, etc., despite the concentration of Iraq, the basic realization of China being the main existential challenge to the United States has continued, an existential systemic challenge to the United States and fellow democracies has continued. And even this Ukraine diversion of Joe Biden and Boris Johnson has not really upset that fundamental trajectory. So, the most important development that is taking place is one, an appreciation of what China represents, and two, a very clear appreciation globally of the reality that the world is no longer in a unipolar moment. There was a time after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, throughout the period of the Clinton administration, when you had a perception of unipolarity. That could have possibly continued in about the first maybe 8 or 9 years of this century, but certainly not after that. So it is not a unipolar world. But what is also clear is that the People's Republic of China, led by the Communist Party of China, would like to create a new unipolarity. This time, not centered around Washington, but centered around Beijing. So I think that is again a fundamental change in what is happening. There are other changes, economic changes, not very pleasant. Some have continued from the 1980s, when you had, whether it was Deng Xiaoping or you had Margaret Thatcher, I mean, you had this feeling of Ronald Reagan, getting rich is glorious. Money is an end in itself. And the consequence of that was being a thinning out of the middle class and an increase in suffering of the lower classes and a huge increase in the wealth of the upper class. I don't think that is sustainable. I don't think that is societally healthy, but that has also been a feature. But I think geopolitically, if we're talking about a geopolitical situation, it is this question of China trying to replace the United States as a unipolar power at a time when the United States is very emphatically no longer the unipolar power.
You put it so well. I mean, in as few words as possible, very eloquently, the entire history. Now, coming to back to the, first of all, we'll talk about the old world, and the questions are also coming in now. The old world we are going to talk about. The old world we talk about was built on colonialism, and those effects of those continued in the education systems all over the world. And the purposely the education systems all over the world were changed to bring people back to their European mindset, the European based teachings. And the new world order, which was pre-existing before today's times, I will say it got institutionalized after World War II. And it also carried forward many things from the colonial period. So do you think that all that impact of colonial era is continuing till date?
I'd like to say that I've never been one for black and white divisions. There are, as you know, the spectrum of light is huge. What we call white light is actually divided into a spectrum of light, and you have an absence of light, and then you have a spectrum in which the colors are not visible. But the reality of the situation is, let's be honest, the world has been colonized in the past and continues to be colonized today by individuals who are, in a sense, for their own benefit, taking advantage, undue and unfair advantage of large numbers of people in the world. Before Western colonization, there were other forms of colonization. And frankly, even before the Mughals, there was colonization by by some princely families, some warlords who took over as princely families. I mean, the best way of being just to have blue blood was to shed a lot of red blood on the battlefield. You shed enough red blood, well, then you're considered to have blue blood.
That's right.
So a lot of these ancient lineages are built on quite a lot of bloodshed. So I'd like to say, Aditya, that yes, there was colonization, Western colonization. And that is why, for example, I am opposed to this idea of some individuals, including, in my view, unfortunately, Joe Biden, and of course, not surprisingly, Macron and Boris Johnson, to expand NATO into Asia. No, that's not going to work. We would like a relationship between the United States and Asia, because we don't see the United States as exclusively a European power. It's a quadricontinental power. It's European, it's African, it's South American, and it's European, of course, as well, but it's also Asian. So from that point of view, we welcome a direct pairing of the United States and Asia in the manner of the pairing of the United States and Europe. And we would definitely not welcome an expansion of NATO, which is a European construct, into Asia. That will bring back memories of the colonial past. And those memories are not going to be very helpful in cooperation. In fact, this entire effort to persuade, I use the word persuade, it's been much less diplomatic, much harsher sometimes than just persuasion, to persuade Asia, Africa, and Latin America to follow the example of Europe in the matter of what is essentially a European conflict in a country that has relevance only in Europe, Ukraine. Ukraine has relevance only in Europe. And that too, it has relevance to the West if they're thinking of a land invasion of Russia. Otherwise, even to the West, it's a secondary theater. But this tremendous concentration of attention on Ukraine and telling the Asians, the Africans, the Latin Americans, oh, we should be, you should be equally part of this. Well, for heaven's sake, you're not part of the struggles that are taking place in Asia. You were part of some of these struggles in Vietnam and all that. That was a mistake. Thank God you're not in that now. But frankly, Aditya, the reality of the situation is that let's not talk about colonialism, because if you break it down, to some extent, each of us are colonialist and each of us are colonially oppressed in a way. So putting it that way, I'd like to say there's a lot of guilt to go around, a lot of suffering to go around. Now, I think, you had talked also, if I may say so, apart from colonialism, what else were we talking about? You were talking about one more factor, if I remember. What exactly is that?
So I'll move on to, I think you answered that in your question also. But now I'll move on to another point about leverages, because when we talk about the West, so if you look at the West is not merely a direction now, because Australia is also considered part of the West, but it's in Asia Pacific. New Zealand is also considered part of West, but it's in Asia Pacific. And I've documented the reasons for that in my one of the earlier books, Gold, Glory, and God, that why it is so. But the point of leverages. Now, you very accurately said the Cold War era and today's multipolarity. You mentioned the word multipolarity, which is a very technical term for many people. You can shed some light on that. But how do the leverages from the colonial era can work in the present times? And how do the leverages from the present times can force other nations to comply? You're on mute.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
You go by what Mahatma Gandhi said, which is let all the doors and windows of my house be open and let me be open to all influences. We have, for example, thanks to the British, they did a lot of terrible things to India. There's no question about it. But at the same time, they left behind the English language, which is, frankly, of immense value to us in our quest for a better life. and our quest to basically be more successful in the knowledge economy. I mean, quite a long time back, I wrote an article for the New Criterion that if you're talking about an Anglosphere, the old Churchillian concept of the Anglosphere was basically the blood of the body. It was ethno-based. It was race-based. But the real Anglosphere today, in a knowledge economy, is the blood of the mind. And if you look at the blood of the mind, there are probably more English-speaking people in India than there are in the United States of America. Of course, the British say that neither Indians nor Americans speak English. But frankly, I don't believe the British speak English. They have a most atrocious accent, especially the plummy British accent. I find that absolutely ridiculous. It's something out of a comic book. But having said that, I'd like to say that the 21st century Anglosphere, India is probably the largest English-speaking country in the world. So we have gained from the West, interaction with the West. The West has gained from interaction with India, with Asia, with Latin America, with Africa. Africa has gained. So the question is only one thing. And that question is very simple. The question is looking at society not in a horizontal way, but not in a vertical way, but in a horizontal way. If we look at each of us as being equal but different, not superior or inferior, the whole problem is a lot of pedagogy, a lot of history has been basically force-fed into us to make us believe in our inferiority or in our superiority. Both are wrong. As I said, just as we are both colonizers and oppressed, we are also, in a sense, superior to others and at the same time inferior to others. So from that point of view, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Asia, Latin America, Europe, North America, the reality is in some ways, as individuals, you are superior, in some ways you are not. And I think it's very important for our pedagogy to instill that horizontal consciousness in society, because a lot of the social problems that we are seeing is based on that perception of superior and inferior. For example, I mean, there are some people in my country, in your country, who have got 130, 140 billion dollars. And what are they going to do with it? Are they going to make the whole thing into a currency mountain and sit around it or play around it or something? Are they going to eat it? Are they going to buy 10,000 Rolls Royces? What are they going to do with it? Beyond a point, it's valueless. Beyond a point, money is completely valueless. Your belongings are valueless when you cross to the other world. But beyond a point, for every individual, money becomes valueless. So you have a lot of people with essentially money that's valueless to them, but which the whole world is valuing. Oh my God, this guy has got 200 billion. He's way better than me. I have only 100 billion, or I have only 10 billion. For heaven's sake, this is a completely, if I may say so, it's not a rational attitude to have. And the problem is that is so deep inside us. And that is what is creating this kind of psychosis in society, this kind of anomy that we are seeing in society. And I think that's where, for example, you're talking about myths and Sattology. That's where an understanding of the history of mankind is so very important. The entire history of mankind, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, is not taught in school curricula in India. Why? Because it's considered to be a religious epic. It's nothing to do with religion. Exactly. I mean, you can regard Lord Ram as a hero, like Julius Caesar, like Alexander. You need not ascribe him in a religion. You can have religions that regard everything as sacred, whether it's a stone, whether it is anything is sacred, not only life forms but even inanimate forms, because everything is created by the eternal force. So in that sense, everything is sacred. But at the same time, you can also have a situation in which, Lord Ram is not seen as sacred and is perfectly all right, so long as you acknowledge that there is something you can learn from his life, something you can learn from the Mahabharata, something you can learn, for example, from the Panchatantra, something you can learn from so many of these ancient Indian epics, which are not taught at all because they are tagged with a religious tag. And so, recovering these epics, not only for Hindus, not only for Indians, but for humanity, is important. I think the Greeks have very correctly recovered a treasure trove of their epics. So have the Italians in the form of the Romans. So has a lot of Western society. But a lot of it is lying unrecovered in India, in parts of Africa, in parts of South America. And these need to be recovered not only for the benefit of those peoples who are there and who share that heritage and culture, but for the whole world.
So, very good points you said. And first of all, I'd like to say my personal joke on the British accent. I'll say when an American is constipated, he sounds just like British. And the second thing which you mentioned about the historicity of many of the ancient cultures. Now, one thing that comes to the mind is, and you mentioned Ramayana, Mahabharata, very good, and you correctly said that these are the literatures to guide us. These are the heroes we have. Unfortunately, we have misguided, we have placed wrong emphasis on different wrong types of leaders. Now, my next question to you in this series, in this same discussion carrying forward, is when we talk about, again, I'll go back to the leverages. Now, leverages are made of historical incidents in the past, and now there is a philosophical difference between the Vedic philosophy. I won't say the East because the Vedic belongs to the whole world. The Vedic philosophy and the Western idea. The Western philosophy is based on man has dominion over matter. Now, most of the exploitation comes from that kind of mindset. And the Vedic philosophy is Ishavasya Idam Sarvam, that everything belongs to God. And man is just here to do their karma and make sure it is preserved. Now these two philosophical differences create a difference in approach as well. What you're mentioning, the Vedic philosophy is the only philosophy which says God is one. There is no other place the God is one, because the religions define their God as different to themselves. So how do you reconcile this Eastern Vedic, I would not say Eastern again, Vedic philosophy belongs to the whole world. So it's a Vedic philosophy and the Western philosophy of man has dominion over matter.
Well, look, the sun goes around the earth. The earth is a spherical entity. So I would again like to say that I'm a little nervous about East and West and North and South and things like that. Because for me, the strength is in fusion. Take, for example, iron. You have pure iron, for example. You have to bring some other metal into it, and then it becomes much stronger. So you have metals that are fused with each other. In the same way, different streams of thought and thinking, fusion is what makes both of them stronger. So it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It equals 200 in the right fusion. So the idea is to find those kind of fusions. You've got medicines, for example. You've got herbal medicines. A lot of that in India is now dying out, unfortunately. The reality is that sometimes you have these herbs, and a combination of herbs becomes very valuable. So the fact is, Aditya, that we don't know where to look for knowledge because it's everywhere. And you're quite right. The eternal is everywhere. You're perfectly right. You're also perfectly right that every theology agrees to the reality of the eternal force. If you look at the Bible, you look at the Quran, look at the Torah, look at the Gayatri mantra of Hinduism. What is the Gayatri mantra? It's a celebration of that great celestial eternal power. The transcendent power that transcends everything and that creates everything and that can destroy everything. So you have this concept of the creator, you have this concept of the destroyer, you have this concept of the preserver, I mean, you can put a religious box to it and say, if you're studying this, well, you're basically, you're getting away from your own faith, whether it's Christianity or whether it's Islam or anything, and you're going into Hinduism. And if you're staying, for example, take the case of Islam. You have a whole set of intermediaries in Islam now, imams, ayatollahs. The fact is that Islam is a religion where there is supposed to be direct communication and connect between the believer and the word of God as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the Holy Quran. Where have all these interlopers and intermediaries come from? They have come to distort the doctrine. Every one of us in that, as I understood that particular faith, every one of us, in whether we are Muslim, whether we are Hindu, whether we are Christian, we have a direct connect to the eternal force. We are from that eternal force. We are born of that eternal force. And, and therefore I'm saying that everyone, even in Islam, now we're talking in terms of a situation like you have Wahhabism, you have Communism. These are very rigid rules and rituals. I happen to believe, Aditya, that the reason for the downfall of what we call the Hindu faith and the overthrow by the Mughals was because the practice got lost in ritual. Every day was spent in ritual after ritual after ritual. If I recall, many of these great victories. Prithviraj, for example, won a great victory. Several victories over Mahmud Ghori. What did he do? He didn't rebuild his army. He didn't learn from the mistakes he made. He went on to temple after temple. And he, went as a sense to propitiate, if I may say so. That is wonderful. You can have faith, but please understand, the greatest temple is inside your mind. That is the most beautiful temple of all. And very importantly, Mahmud Ghori, what did he do? He learned from his mistakes. So he attacked at night when he knew that the Rajputs were sleeping. He attacked at night. He attacked through concentrated ways from different locations instead of a single thrust. He learned from his mistakes. Regrettably, he defeated Prithviraj. And unlike Prithviraj, who was very, very generous to him multiple times, as soon as he won over Prithviraj, he eliminated Prithviraj completely. He was absolutely ruthless. He reminds me, for example, of the British in India. If you're a Briton and you steal from another Briton, you're in trouble. You go to prison. You steal from an Indian, no problem. You build a castle in England. So you're free to steal from the natives, but you can't steal from, quote unquote, your own people. So let's be honest. This is a complex world, Aditya, and we can't reduce it in a simple manner. And most importantly, just as racial supremacy is wrong, I think it is something for a mental asylum inmate if he believes or she believes that there is some inherent superiority in any particular race. You had a psychotic individual named Adolf Hitler who carried that particular absurd theory to very unpleasant limits. But the reality is, just as racial supremacy is wrong, religious supremacy is equally wrong. If you think that your particular religion is superior to other religions, please understand one thing. The essence of faith is dharma, is dharmic. You have studied that, you know what I mean. And dharma and religion are not the same at all.
Exactly.
Organized religion especially is not the same. And what we are seeing in some religions today, this expansion of ritual that is now taking place. They're going the same way as the kings of India went, where much of the day was spent in one ritual after the other. And now you see in the United States, you have this decision by the Supreme Court, frankly taking away a lot of the freedoms that were there, that were given out 50 years ago. And those freedoms will probably be met by other freedoms being taken away. And you're going to have a very unpleasant situation societally, which will be to the benefit of the Sino-Russian alliance and the Sino-Wahhabi alliance, which is looking to weaken US society. So you have, I'm not saying that, that a particular camp in this is right or wrong. I'm only saying, as an individual, you have the right to decide certain things very, very clearly. And the more freedom you have, the more right you have, the better it is for society. Why did that little island called Britain take over so much of the world? Because the British Queen was much less powerful than the French king, and the kings came soon after the so-called revolution. You had Napoleon crowning himself, or the Spanish king or queen. The British king or queen was much weaker. The British people were much more empowered. They went out boldly and did things. And they didn't have to look back over his shoulder and say, oh, what will the king think? What will this courtier think? No, they went and did it. And then came back and said, this is what I've done. You understand? So that kind of individual empowerment is very important. And I think what you're calling of Sattology, what you're calling in terms of, what I call in terms of faith, the essential humanity of faith, the essential dharmic faith, that I think is a way of self-empowerment. And the more individuals in this world are empowered, the more the world is empowered. As you saw, there's a movie called Jersey, which is now playing in India, Hindi audiences. And, a young boy was told by his father, a great cricketer, that, look, you're not the captain if you're the best player. You're the captain if you bring out the best in your players. That's absolutely right. That's the duty of a leader, not to be better than everybody else, but to bring out the better in everybody else. So you understand, Aditya. So I think we are looking at things in a very wrong way. The society is falling into that kind of a pit. It's a problem. I don't see an easy escape. It's happening in India, happening in the US, the two big democracies. Fault lines are growing, hate is growing, anger is growing, which frankly is self-defeating, even for those who are angry and hating and full of hate. I want to just, this particular answer, I want to just confine by saying that, look, I honestly believe that Kashi, Mathura, and Ayodhya, these are the three holy sites of the Sanatanis. India was divided on the basis of faith. And I can't for the life of me understand why it is that the government that came to power in a divided India could not understand the importance of these three to the Hindu faith and restore them to what they were before Aurangzeb destroyed them. I'm not saying restore them to what they were before the Mughals came. Restore them to what they were when Jahangir was there, when Shah Jahan was there. Do that. But even that was not done. So the question is, you have to have a certain amount of justice, for everybody, for every section of society. And that, if you don't have that justice, if things get out of equilibrium, then your society is going to land into problems. We are landing into problems because we don't recognize the equilibrium. We're not even trying to find it. We don't recognize it. So we're going often in the wrong direction.
Great points you made. And also you emphasized on the three temples which were there, which is very dear to all of us. One last question. I know you have to go somewhere. One last question on this in this series is, I'm going to invite you again because a lot of things to discuss here. A lot of questions are coming in. So you see the world. This is a comment by Rachel. Now, Rachel is saying this is the first time she's from Connecticut, UConn, and she's a policy student. She's doing her policy. She's actually doing her law, but she loves policies, and that's what she's going to make her career in. So I'm going to rephrase her question. Question is very long. I'm going to rephrase it for you. So the question is, you have put the entire history and the modern strategic perspective in one lens, which is very rare for people to do it. Because people try to see today's politics as today's current affairs only, but it is not current affairs. It comes from generations of university teachings, and which is going on from since World War II, which is largely a propaganda, where to put it American exceptionalism or American race as superior to everyone else. And by the way, her father was a politician, was a member of Senate. So the question is that in today's perspective, when you look at the world in today's perspective, and I'm going to put my own thoughts also, Rachel, excuse me for that. In today's perspective, when we look at the world from the prism of colonialism, capitalism, communism, the missing point is humanism, which you said it, that we have to see from a different perspective. And also, Sarve Sukhino Bhavantu, very traditional Sanskrit words, let everyone be happy. And but the world is the world when you look at from the again I have to play a devil's advocate. When we say man has a dominion over matter, then certain men are considered to be more privileged than the others, and that's why the civilizing movements have been started. So so the question is, as India is rising in this multipolar world, how does India take sermonizing from the West? Did I ask properly?
Well, thank you very much. I would like to say that, uh, I mean, not very well, I'm afraid. Not too many people, appreciate sermonizing. But what is striking to me is the way so many politicians in the West have become almost, a zeal of missionaries to spread the faith, to spread the gospel. And the gospel is that Ukraine is the most important country in the world for the future of mankind. Europe is the center point of the world. And the United States, is of course tied up with Europe. Now, the point is, I've said this quite often, right from the time I used to come to Washington in the 1990s, and I used to get a pretty chilly reception because at that time, two things. One is the Clintons were completely Europeanists. For them, America was a corner or a part of Europe that has been separated by the Atlantic Ocean. It is not true. It's a quadricontinental country. And secondly, India, they said, my God, what is a country like India doing with nuclear technology, space technology? You should just be giving up all these things immediately. And Kashmir, it's a Muslim majority state. How on earth can a Hindu state, India? That's what they used to tell me. And I had multiple meetings, including some organized in the State Department, etc. And I used to tell them, please understand one thing. So at that point in time, I think it was about 140 million. Today we have about 200 million Muslims, and they're amazingly productive citizens of our country. So the point is this, if you're talking about Muslim majority should then break away. You have some cities in the US, in Detroit, for example, which have got a numerical majority. So should those boroughs break away from Detroit and form an independent community, a self-governing community, purely on the basis of faith? And do you want to have what's called an Article 370? In India, Article 370, an abomination, was only recently removed, and in which it said that nobody could come and settle in Kashmir from outside Kashmir, from anywhere else in India. Look, if you're going to say that the only people who can settle in Texas are those who come from Texas, and that too of a particular type of individual from Texas, it would be an abomination. That's what Article 370 is. And when Article 370 was removed by Prime Minister Modi, there was a hue and cry that, my God, you're trifling with justice, you're trifling with human rights. Well, the fact is that, when you have a law which prevents other people from the country from having equal treatment in a part of the country, it's effectively no longer a part of that country. And another point is, for example, in India, if you belong to a particular faith, you're allowed to have 4 wives. In the United States or in the UK, people who lecture India because there is an effort to have a uniform civil code in which everybody has 1 wife. Frankly, Aditya, I'm perfectly happy with my wife, Lakshmi. You know her very well. I certainly don't want anybody else. And thank God. And I'm not even sure that I would be able to handle anybody else. But the reality of the situation is that, in the West, a uniform civil code is assumed. But in India, when you talk about uniform civil code, you are being quote unquote anti-Muslim. When you talk about Article 370 being removed, in other words, anybody from outside Texas can settle in Texas. It's not only you as a Texan, but somebody from California, somebody from New York, for heaven's sake, even somebody from India may be able to sneak into Texas. Well, no, that is completely off base. It can't be done. So the reality is you're seeing India through a completely magic mirror lens. And magic mirrors distort the truth. So the problem is a lot of Western statespersons go into their think tanks, their textbooks, their professors, their academics, their policymakers. They wear the magic lenses in looking at countries outside their sphere of influence. They may, for example, take the travel schedules of, let's say, Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan. I don't know the travel schedules, but I would guess that it's almost entirely dominated by transatlantic trips. So for them, it's Europe and America. That's it, not the rest of the world. I'm sure that not even a tenth of the travel they've done into the rest of the world as they've done in Europe, to Europe. So this is the problem. When you look through a very narrow lens, when you look through magic mirrors are for an amusement park. They're not meant for scientific analysis. And I think the problem is a lot of what passes for scientific analysis is basically using the magic mirrors of fake perceptions. And that is what has driven so much of bad policy. India and the United States, for example, are absolutely essential partners in confronting the attempt of China to be the new hegemon of the Indo-Pacific. But look at the magic mirrors that each of us has got in looking at the other country. A huge number of them. There's so many misunderstandings take place as a consequence of that. So I think, Aditya, it's a terrible work in progress. But I'd again like to say, I think the young lady is perfectly right. Going back to a Western philosopher, Regis Debray, I remember reading a book by him long back, that we are never entirely contemporaneous with our present. We are always, we carry the past with us into the present. It's like, dragging your high school textbooks with you when you attend university, and dragging your university textbooks with you and your high school textbooks with you when you're doing a doctoral thesis. Frankly, the important thing about scholarship is not only remembering things, but remembering what to completely forget. And those who forget to forget are frankly some of them do not become the best of scholars. So I don't really like to say this is a problem. Look, I'd like to say that I've got some solutions to these problems, but I'm just looking at it, I'm just pointing it out. But I'd like to say, when I get into a problem, I try and get into the grain of it. I try and look at it not only through a telescope, but through a microscope, if possible, an electronic microscope, so you can see the different patterns emerge, and you can try and track the patterns. Because if you do that, then you get a clear understanding. If you break down a problem into its components and analyze the components, but if you keep a problem in a huge mass, which is really not really very descriptive of the inner situation in the problem, you run into problems. As I said, I can only tell you what the problem is. I'm sorry, I have no solution.
Now, the democracy and human rights has been used, again, this is a question, has been used by the administration, successive administrations, for regime change, and also used as leverage for bringing some others to the talking points as per the, and you correctly said, the transatlantic view of the American politicians is stifling the American economy now, because their trade is more dependent on Asia, not on their wealth comes from Asia, not from Europe. Europe has been largely individualistic in a respect that each country looks for itself in Europe. So American wealth comes from Asia, and 65% of American population is of European descent. And I'll also quote, I have a very good friend who is watching right now, who is a Native American leader. And he's saying, we gifted USA to you to take care of it. Do not destroy it. That's a line of the guy, Hashimo. I cannot say her last name, but he belongs to the Ojibwe tribe, which is the biggest tribe in Northeast. And he also wrote the foreword of my book, Gold, Glory, and God. So, sir, I'm quoting you right now. So 65% is European, and only 7% today is Native American. And he's saying we gave the constitution to European settlers. American constitution has come from Ojibwe tribe. Actually, the 13 tribes gave the constitution, and the liberty and the respect for human. But he says the word American is a Portuguese word. It's not a native word. So his point is, when we talk about identity politics, why not America be called another extension of Europe?
Well, I'd only like to say that as you correctly said, America is not an extension of Europe. America has citizens of the kind of versatility that has just been your friend who has just asked that question. And I wish that people in America over the last 100 years, or Europe, had understood the teachings of the original inhabitants of the United States, the American Indians, and their protection and preservation of nature. Sustainability. A lot of what we're talking today has been taught by the Indian tribes over centuries and centuries. That's exactly what we're speaking today. Sustainability, a green ecosystem. These are not new concepts. These didn't come day before yesterday. They came hundreds of years ago, and they came. A large number of them came from the American Indians. So so I quite agree that this is what my point is. Wisdom can come from practically from anywhere. There's no question about it. So as far as America being a part of Europe is concerned, well, you're quite right about Europe. They basically look entirely for themselves, and they're still in that hangover. I think the problem is that all their textbooks celebrate all the glorious things they did as colonial powers. According to the textbooks, it is one glorious history of empowerment of mankind. The more you are colonized and the more you oppress, the greater the benefit you're giving to that society. And that's not entirely true. That's not the way the people who have undergone that have looked at it. But look, Aditya, ultimately reality will bite. Take, for example, Ukraine. Russia is a mine of so much of resources. And I have been saying for some time, it's not just gross domestic product, GDP. It's gross national resources, GNR, that counts. Russia is a giant in gross national resources. And the world cannot do without Russian resources. It's not just in oil and gas. It's in so many other minerals, so many other items in which Russia has got it in abundance. And if you're cutting yourself off from that, as Europe is, in my view, Europe is going to regress to a situation in which European countries within about a generation are going to look very much as South America looked about 20 years ago. Europe is traveling back in time to South America by cutting itself off from the country which has got the most richest store of resources in the world. That's why I have been very clear that we cannot abandon Russian resources. It's a poor country. We are a poor country. We need to build up the economic life for our people. And any country, poor or rich, you need Russian resources to survive. And I think the bet made by Biden and Johnson and others was that Putin will collapse very soon, that the Russian system will collapse very soon, that soon you'll have somebody like a Yeltsin or a Gorbachev who essentially will sign on whatever the NATO wants him to sign on. It's not happened. And I don't think it's ever going to happen. In my view, don't wish for something, because if Putin is removed, 10 times more fanatic Russian is going to come as the master of Russia. 10 times more fanatic than Putin is going to come. So that is the mood in Russia now after NATO's activities regarding Ukraine. So we can't do without Russia. The world cannot do without Russia. And not only Russia, you cannot do without almost any country in the world, because every country is unique in some form or the other. So we have to understand that. But for me, this human rights thing is so amusing, because what is happening now? Oh, they're attacking Russia. I mean, this poor lady, Ursula von der Leyen, who wants us to buy, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese solar panels. I mean, that's what she means when she says India must go green immediately. The solar panels will all then be Chinese, and we'll have to spend more than $100 billion a year, much more than that, on buying those channels. She's a great saleswoman for Chinese solar panels, I must say. I must compliment the European Union on having a good saleswoman as its principal commissioner. But the fact of the matter is that we need those resources. The world needs those resources. And look at the problems that are being caused by these logistics chains being upset. And after a time, the voters in these countries are going to realize that the responsibility is on these sanctions. The sanctions that are blocking Russian resources from coming. By all means, be opposed to Ukraine or what Russia is doing. Frankly, the French have gone militarily into many countries in Africa. The United States, other countries have gone militarily into other countries. I don't think that's right. Any of these military invasions is wrong, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the reality is, Ukraine is critical to Russian security, in the sense Ukraine and Belarus are the areas where you can enter Russia in a kinetic conflict insofar as the field armies are concerned. So obviously, it's something of immediate concern to Putin. And obviously, Ukraine coming under the control of a government which is Russophobic was not very well liked. Now, again, as I say, I am not in any way downscaling the horrible things that Russia is doing in Ukraine. But I'd only like to point out that Ukraine is not the be-all and end-all of the global problem. The globe has got many problems beyond Ukraine. And if so much of oxygen and attention is diverted to that problem, it gets diverted away from other problems. And the most amusing thing is, the very people who are condemning Russia are making a beeline to Beijing to touch the feet of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is today the happiest man in the world. Every Western leader is paying court to him. Sir, the great Xi, great China, save us.